Tiger Woods' recent comments, casually delivered while discussing scheduling, recovery, and longevity, quietly unsettled the PGA Tour because they introduced something far more powerful than criticism: uncertainty, as he acknowledged that elite careers are physically demanding. The schedule is punishing, and the current system may not serve players indefinitely. A perspective that felt seismic precisely because Woods has long been the Tour's most loyal stabilizing force, defending its structure through legal battles and rival threats. And while he didn't call for reform, endorse alternatives, or predict collapse, his framing suggested limits rather than permanence, prompting those who understand the Tour's inner dynamics to recognize the implications immediately. Since Tiger isn't just another player, but the Tour's symbolic and operational center, whose presence shapes broadcasts, sponsorships, and player pathways, meaning that when he hints at strain, it doesn't destabilize the Tour outright, but questions its inevitability, and in professional sports, subtle doubt introduced by someone of his gravity can move locker rooms, leadership, and markets faster than any public confrontation. Tiger Woods' influence has always been measured by how close people are to him, creating a web of cultural and financial reliance across the PGA Tour. Even as he publicly downplayed bigger questions by saying he simply wants to return to playing and sort out his schedule later. But behind the scenes, his role had already shifted. Because when he joined the policy board, he became less of a competitor and more of a stabilizing force, especially during the LIV Golf split, when his presence helped steady uncertain players in a way few executives ever could. And even with limited appearances, his neutral stance has continued to signal whether the system feels strong or fragile. So when his recent comments avoided pushing for change, yet quietly removed a layer of reassurance, players began rethinking priorities and sponsors started adjusting expectations. Since in a sport built on trust and alignment, the lack of certainty from Tiger alone can be disruptive, meaning even a slight shift from the Tour's center of gravity affects everything around it. And while sponsors publicly reaffirmed partnerships, kept logos in place, and stressed stability, privately marketing teams studied his words closely, running cautious scenarios around fan engagement, star power, and broadcast reliability, not out of panic, but careful planning. Because the PGA Tour's value lies in predictability, and Tiger's acknowledgement of strain subtly changed that equation, leading some mid-level sponsors to slow renewal talks, not cancel them, signaling that long-assumed continuity could no longer be fully guaranteed in modern sports business. Hesitation is measurable, and while the PGA Tour's balance sheet did not collapse, its leverage quietly shifted because stability now has to be proven rather than assumed. A change that ripples through negotiations, advertising, and long-term strategy. Meaning Tiger Woods' words subtly altered the Tour's financial position. And that uncertainty did not stop with sponsors, but spread to players whose careers depend on that stability, raising a larger question about what happens when loyalty becomes a practical calculation instead of a moral one. Because before his statement, the PGA Tour LIV Golf conflict had settled into a fragile equilibrium shaped by legal agreements, schedule compromises, and fewer defections, creating the appearance of calm. But Tiger disrupted that balance not by endorsing LIV, but by removing the unspoken assumption that loyalty to the Tour was unquestionable, giving hesitant players permission to explore alternatives, prompting agents to reopen discussions around scheduling, appearance fees, and long-term sustainability, not triggering immediate departures, but reframing private conversations. As players reassessed priorities, sponsors re-examined risk, and executives weighed contingency plans. Since in professional sport, perception often drives action, and by quietly questioning structural endurance, Tiger reopened a conflict that seemed dormant, felt not in headlines but in locker rooms, boardrooms, and negotiations, meaning he did not restart the war publicly, but reignited it privately. with the real impact showing first in how players began thinking about their careers, setting the stage for subtle but meaningful shifts inside the locker room as certainty faded. No one challenged Tiger directly, and on the surface, the tour appeared unchanged. Privately, the response was very different. Veteran players describe Woods' statement as permission to finally voice concerns about scheduling, physical strain, and long-term career planning. Younger players interpreted it as validation, proof that uncertainty was not disloyalty, but realism. Conversations that had been dormant for months resurfaced almost immediately. Locker rooms, group chats, and quiet meetings with agents became spaces for questions that had once been carefully avoided. Coaches and player managers noticed subtle but meaningful shifts, increased emphasis on off-season recovery, renewed interest in appearance-based contracts, and hesitation around multi-year commitments. Even the language changed. Players began speaking less about loyalty and more about sustainability. In professional sports, language always precedes action. Long before decisions become public, shifts in internal sentiment begin reshaping priorities and behavior. Tiger's measured comment didn't ignite outrage, but it quietly altered the locker room psychology. It didn't just change opinions. It changed how players behaved. And when behavior changes at the player level, the next pressure point is always the system that pays for it. The PGA Tour remains financially strong. Prize funds are high. Broadcast contracts are secure. Sponsorship portfolios remain extensive. But beneath that stability lies a fragile chain of assumptions. Player retention sustains star power. Star power drives media rights. Media rights justify sponsorship investment. Remove confidence at any point, and the system feels strain. Tiger Woods' statement introduced friction into that chain. By questioning whether the tour's structure could truly sustain elite careers over time, he forced sponsors, executives, and players alike to reassess risk. Not publicly, quietly, and in systems built on confidence. Quiet reassessment is often the most destabilizing force of all. Renewal discussions grew more conditional. Agencies began requesting detailed scenario planning around player participation, audience engagement, and schedule reliability. Long-term guarantees were scrutinized more closely, even as headline figures remained unchanged. The financial ecosystem did not collapse overnight, but leverage quietly shifted. Sponsors now operate with greater caution. Executives are no longer rewarded for assuming continuity. They are expected to prove it. In modern sports, financial security depends as much on perceived stability as it does on actual revenue. Confidence is currency, and once questioned, it must be re-earned. So that's the takeaway. The PGA Tour's finances remain strong, but the assumptions holding them together are no longer automatic. Stability now has to be defended contract by contract, negotiation by negotiation, and that raises the bigger question. If the money is still there, but the certainty is not, what does the PGA Tour become next? Collapse or reinvention? The tour did not collapse following Tiger Woods' statement. No events were canceled. No contracts were torn up. But the perception of inevitability, the belief that the tour's dominance was untouchable, quietly eroded. Institutions rarely weaken first by losing money. They weaken when they lose narrative certainty. Woods' remarks exposed a deeper truth. The tour's strength has always depended not just on structure, but on alignment, cultural, psychological, and symbolic. His words revealed how reliant the system remains on central figures to sustain belief. With that belief softened, players began reassessing priorities. Not dramatically, not publicly, but internally where real change always begins. Sponsors reevaluated risk, and executives were forced to justify stability rather than rely on tradition. Tiger Woods did not end the tour's dominance. He exposed its dependence on influence, trust, and perception. That subtle shift, largely invisible to the public, may shape strategic decisions for years, pushing the PGA Tour toward reinvention instead of complacency. This was never just about one statement or one player, but about how long stability can be assumed before it must be proven, and how quietly influence reshapes systems more powerfully than open conflict ever does. What comes next may matter more than lawsuits or rival leagues, because the Tour's future will be shaped less by headlines than by trust, alignment, and the choices made when certainty is no longer guaranteed. Click here on the cards to watch more.